Delia Ruark did not step back when the beam scale swung around and the iron hook passed a hand's width from her face, and every man leaning on the Halloway stock pens saw her not step back. And that was the beginning of it. It was the 3rd day of October 1884, a Friday, and the wind out of the south had been blowing hot for 11 days without stopping. And the buffalo grass on the Two Wells Divide had cured the color of a lion's hide. She had 12 days left to plow 2 miles of fireguard around her hay and her section line, or the county would fine her $50 and hold her liable for any fire that crossed her ground. And she owned exactly one horse that could still pull, and he was spavined in both hocks and 11 years old. That was the arithmetic she had carried 9 miles into town that morning, walking, because the pony was too light for the plow, and she would not ride a horse she meant to work. Amos Prentice was a horse and hide buyer out of Dodge, and he came through Halloway twice a year with a string of what the trade called canners. He bought the worn out, the crippled, the old, the spoiled. He bought them by weight, a cent a pound, and he weighed them on a beam scale rigged from a tripod of freight poles at the loading chute, and when a horse would not walk onto the plank platform, he had a man behind it with a whip and a man ahead of it with a twitch, and the horse walked. He had 22 head in the pen that morning. By Monday they would be moving south in a string, and after that they would be hides and tallow and bone meal, and nobody in the county would think about them again. The men on the rail were not there to buy. They were there to watch. That was the free entertainment of a slow Friday in a town of 400 souls, and Delia Ruark walking in through the pen gate in a faded blue prairie dress with her sleeves rolled past the elbow was better entertainment than the scale. "You lost, Mrs. Ruark?" That was Pruitt Prine, who kept the store and who kept her account, and who had made a point of saying the word account out loud in front of other people twice that summer. "No," she said. "If you have come this far with her, subscribe and follow along, because the horse she is about to buy is the reason I am telling any of this, and what that horse does 24 days from now changed the price of a certain kind of animal in 3 counties. She went down the line of them slow, the way her husband had taught her before he died, which was to look at the feet first and the eyes second and the head last, because a man who looks at the head first will buy a pretty animal that cannot stand up. There was a roan gelding with a bowed tendon like a bent stovepipe. There was a gray so old his teeth had worn to smooth pegs and his lip hung. There was a big boned brown that would have been worth $60 4 years ago and was worth $9.40 now because he had been rope burned around one pastern until the tendon had gone to gristle. She put her hand flat on his shoulder anyway, and he swung his head to look at her with the mild, uncurious patience of an animal who has stopped expecting anything. And she felt something go through her that she had no intention of letting show on her face. At the far end, against the plank fence where the shade was, stood a sorrel Mare. She was standing square. That was the first thing. Every other horse in that pen was cocked on one hip, or shifted off a sore foot, or standing with its head jammed into a corner. And the sorrel was standing square on all 4, with her head up and her ears working, and she was watching the smoke. There was a branding fire going in the next pen over, a small one, a cedar root fire with a running iron in it, and the wind was laying the smoke flat across the top rails and pushing it in a gray sheet through the whole line of pens. When it hit, 21 horses threw their heads. The gray hunched. The roan spun on his hocks and slammed the fence. 2 of them went to the far corner and stood shaking with their nostrils wide and red inside. The sorrel mare turned her face into it, not away from it, into it. She lifted her nose maybe 4 inches and turned it into the smoke the way a woman turns her face into a door she has heard something behind. And she took 2 steps toward the branding pen and stopped, and she stood there in the middle of that gray sheet with her eyes half shut and her ears steady, and she did not move again. Delia Ruark stood very still herself and watched her for a long time. The mare was copper-colored, a good deep sorrel, and she had a blaze wide as a hand from her forelock down to her muzzle, where it went pink. She was maybe 9. Her chest was deep, and her hind end was heavy, and she had the low sloped croup, and the thick gaskin of an animal bred to lean into a collar. And she carried her weight on good clean legs, with no windgalls and no bumps, and she was, in every way that mattered to somebody who needed to pull a plow through sod, exactly the horse. And down her whole near side, from the point of her shoulder back across the ribs and into the stifle, ran a country of pale, hairless skin, shining faintly in the sun, with the good copper hair grown back thin, and white flecked around the edges of it, in a shape like a map of a river and all its creeks. The mane on that side had come back short and uneven, a hand shorter than the off side, standing up in a stiff, ragged brush. Her left ear was tipped at the top, folded over about a half-inch, and heeled that way, a small permanent bend that made her look, from certain angles, like she was listening to two things at once. "That one's not for sale," Prentice said behind her. He had come up with the ledger under his arm. "Well, she's for sale. I mean, she's not for you." "How much?" "You don't want her, ma'am." "How much?" Prentice sighed the sigh of a man who has been through this. $9, he said. $9.40 on the beam, and I'd take 9. And I'll tell you why, so you don't come find me in the spring. That mare's smoke crazy. Behind him at the rail, somebody laughed. It was not a cruel laugh yet. That came later. "Explain it," Delia said. "Ain't much to explain," he said, and explained it anyway, and the explanation was the one that had followed that mare through 4 owners in 2 years. She had been caught in the big burn in the fall of 1881, out west of there somewhere, and anybody with eyes could see what it had done to her, and since then she was wrong. She would not work a fire. She would not lead past a branding fire, nor go by a stovepipe, nor be trusted anywhere near a burn-off. A man in Sparta had kept her 3 months and handed her over for nothing. And Prentice had only taken her because she weighed what she weighed. "She's meat, ma'am," he finished. "She's a good-looking piece of meat, and I'm sorry to say it plain in front of a lady, but you asked me twice." Delia looked back at the mare. The mare was still standing in the smoke. The branding fire had got a little green wood in it, and it was rolling now. And the sheet had thickened until you could taste the cedar in it at 30 feet, and the sorrel mare was standing in the thick of it, with her eyes closed, and her lower lip loose, and one hind foot cocked at last, resting. "She won't lead past a fire," Delia said. "That's right, Amos," she said. "She is in the fire." Prentice turned around and looked at his own horse-pen for what appeared to be the first time in an hour. The smoke shifted. The sorrel's outline came and went in it. Prentice's jaw moved twice, and nothing came out of it. "She'll spook when it counts," he said finally. "They all do." $9. "Ma'am." "I have $9, Delia Ruark said, and she took it out of her apron pocket. And it was not paper. It was silver, 5 cartwheel dollars and 8 halves, and it had been in a coffee tin under the 3rd-floor plank of her soddy since the February her husband died, and everybody at that rail heard her count it out into her palm, 1 coin at a time, because she counted out loud. That was when the laughing started for real. It came off the rail like a covey going up. Sim Rathbone was on the rail, the Chalk Bluff foreman, a long-boned man with a face like a hatchet and a way of laughing with no sound in it, just the shoulders. Josiah Kerr, the blacksmith, laughed, and he was not an unkind man, and he was ashamed of it later and told her so. 2 of the Barcross hands went into each other's shoulders like schoolboys. Pruitt Prine laughed with his mouth wide and his head back. $9 for a burnt one, one of the hands called out. "Delia, there's $9 of good jerky standing right behind her, and it don't need shoeing. She's buying her a lap robe, buying her a hearth rug, more like." half of one. 12 days to plow guard, and she buys the one horse in Kansas that's scared of fire. That last one was Rathbone, and Rathbone did not shout it. He said it at a conversational level to the man beside him, and the wind took it down the rail anyway, and it landed on every ear at the pens, and it was the sentence that went into town and got repeated at the store and at the smithy and at the Sunday dinner tables for the next 3 weeks, and finally got repeated in a courtroom, which Sim Rathbone would have paid a great deal of money to take back. Delia Ruark did not look at the rail. That was the thing about her that people misread all her life. They thought she did not hear it. She heard every word of it, and she filed every word of it, and she had a memory like a tally book. But she had learned at 19 that a woman who turns around to answer a rail full of men has agreed to a conversation she cannot win, and a woman who keeps walking has not agreed to anything. She put the $9 in Amos Prentice's hand. He wrote it in the ledger, and he wrote her a bill of sale on a leaf torn out of the back of it, and he was careful about it, and she noticed that he was careful about it, and later that carefulness turned out to matter more than either of them knew that morning. Sorrel Mare, about 9 years, 15 hands 2, white blaze, 1 white sock left hind, scars near side, connected veau left hip. Sold to Delia Ruark of Halloway County this 3rd day of October 1884 for the sum of $9, no warranty of soundness or disposition given or implied. He signed it, and she folded it into her apron. Connected veau, she said. You know the brand? No, ma'am. Never troubled to look it up. Brand don't add to the weight. She went into the pen with a cotton lead rope she had brought from home. And every man on that rail leaned forward to watch a woman get run over, and the sorrel mare stood square while she came, and let herself be haltered, and stepped off behind her at the shoulder, with a slack rope like a horse that had been led 10,000 miles. At the gate she stopped, and looked back once at the branding fire. Then she walked out into the street beside a woman in a blue dress, with $9 gone out of her apron, and the two of them went south down the Sparta road in the hot wind, and behind them the laughing went on for a while, and then dropped off the way laughing does, when the thing being laughed at has gone too far away to hear it, and the men went back to watching the beam scale swing. It was 9 miles home. Delia Ruark walked every one of them, and led the mare and did not ride her, and she talked the whole way, low and steady, the way she had talked to her husband the last 4 days of his life when he could not answer. The Ruark place sat on the south lip of the Two Wells Divide, where the shortgrass ran out to the sky in 3 directions and broke down into Cutbank Draw in the 4th. 160 acres. A soddy dug back into the slope with a plank front and 2 real glass windows Tom Ruark had freighted from the railhead at Sparta the first summer. A dugout barn roofed with poles and sod, a pole corral, a chicken house made of the crate the windows came in, and 40 acres of hay meadow along the draw where the grass grew belly high on a horse because the seep kept it green when everything on the flat went the color of a saddle. There was a windmill tower, standing 40 feet from the door, with no wheel on it. Tom had put the tower up in April of 1883, and had gone to bed with a chill on the 8th of February, and had never got up again, and the wheel and the vane were still in their crate under a tarp behind the barn, and Delia had not opened the crate in 20 months, and she could not have told anybody why. The stock came to the fence when she led the mare in. Pilot came first, an 11-year-old bay gelding with hocks like doorknobs who had done every honest thing asked of him for 8 years and had got spavined for it. Bird, the pony, a shaggy brown thing with a Mustang head. 9 cows, 2 shoats, 21 hens, and a rooster with a broken toe. That was the whole of it. That and a quarter section, and a note at the Halloway County Bank for $240 that came due on the 1st of March. Delia turned the sorrel mare into the corral and stood at the rails and watched her. The mare walked the fence one time around, which any horse will do, and then she stopped at the water and drank a long time. And then she did a thing Delia had never seen a strange horse do on a new place. She walked to the exact center of the corral, in the open, with her back to nothing, and she stood there and went to sleep on her feet. A horse picks a corner. A horse puts its hindquarters to something solid so that the only thing to watch is the front. Every horse Delia Ruark had ever handled did that, and this one walked out into the middle of the open, where anything could come at her from any side, and dropped her head and rested a hindfoot and slept. "You've been someplace," Delia said. That night she trimmed the lamp. It was Tom's lamp, a plain tin kerosene lamp with a chimney he had cracked and mended with a copper wire. And the wick in it had burned down so far it was mostly char, and she got out the shears and cut the black off the top of it square across and turned it up. The flame came clean and yellow and steadied. She sat with her hands around the coffee cup and looked at it a while. There is nothing to a wick. It is a strip of woven cotton worth a fraction of a cent. It is the cheapest thing in the lamp and the ugliest, and it goes black and crooked, and any fool will tell you it is the part to throw away. And there is no lamp without it. The oil cannot burn. The chimney has nothing to hold. The whole apparatus of brass and tin and glass sits dark on the table, waiting for one worthless strip of cotton to carry the fire up out of the well where it cannot burn anything, and hold it up in the air where it can be some use to somebody. "Wick," she said out loud, in the empty room, and that was the mare's name from then on, and she never called her anything else. In the morning she went out at first gray with the harness over her shoulder to find out what she had bought. She had it planned careful, the way you plan a thing you expect to go wrong. Corral gate shut. Nothing loose in the pen. Halter and a long lead first, and if that went well, the surcingle, and if that went well, maybe by afternoon the collar. She had broken 2 horses to harness in her life, and helped with a third, and she knew how long it took, and she knew what a 9-year-old mare with a bad name could do to a woman alone on a place 9 miles from a doctor. She got the halter on, and the mare stood. She laid the lead rope over the mare's back and drew it off the far side, and the mare stood. She put her hand under the belly, and the mare stood. She brought the collar up, and the mare dropped her head into it before Delia had it open, which is a thing a horse only does when a collar has come at her 10,000 times, and then she stood with her head down, and her ears loose while the hames went on, and the throat strap buckled and the breeching came around her thighs. And when Delia took up the lines and said, in a voice she barely got out of her throat, "Back," the mare backed 4 steps square and true, with her hocks under her, and stopped. Delia Ruark stood in her own corral at 7 o'clock in the morning, holding a set of lines with her heart, going like a bird in a box. "Somebody spent a year on you," she said. "Somebody spent 3. She hitched her single to the stone boat first, because that is what you do, and Wick leaned into the collar and took up the slack without a jerk and walked off with a flat rock the size of a stove sliding behind her like it was nothing. She turned off the voice. G and Haw both, off the voice alone, no line pressure. She stopped on Woe, and she stood on Woe. And she stood while Delia walked out ahead of her, and around behind her and under the traces, and she stood while Delia dropped a bucket on purpose, and she stood while the rooster went off the fence into her face, and she stood. By 9 o'clock, Delia had done the thing she had been circling all morning, without admitting it, which was to go over to the ash pit and rake the banked coals out of last night's fire into a shovel and carry them out to the middle of the corral and lay a handful of dry grass and 3 sticks of cottonwood on them and let it come up into a real little fire. Then she led the mare to it. She led her from 10 feet, and the mare came. And at 4 feet Delia stopped, and the mare walked past her to the end of the lead and put her nose down over the flame close enough that Delia yelled and grabbed the rope, and Wick lifted her head about a foot and stood there with the smoke going straight up past her jaw and her one tipped ear turning slow. "Lord God," Delia said. She stayed out there with her most of the morning. She moved the fire and led her to it. She put the fire between the mare and the gate. She threw green grass on it until it smoked white and thick, and she walked the mare into the middle of the smoke and dropped the lead rope on the ground. And Wick stood in it with her eyes closed and her lip loose, resting, exactly the way she had stood in Amos Prentice's pen. Exactly the way an animal stands somewhere it has been told 1,000 times that it is safe to stand. A horse is not born like that. There is nothing in a horse that says stand in the smoke. Everything in a horse says the opposite, from 4 million years back, and any man who has ever tried to get a saddle horse past a burning haystack knows it in his arms and his shoulders. Somebody had made her that way. Somebody had taken a young sorrel filly and worked her at it in small pieces every day for a long time, the way you make a horse do anything, and had gone on doing it past the point where it was interesting, and had built a thing that did not exist in nature, and then had turned her loose or lost her or died. And the horse had come down through 4 owners and a hide buyer with the whole of it still inside her, and nobody had thought to ask a single question. Because what they saw was a scarred mare standing still when other horses ran, and there is no word for that in the language of men who work stock. So they had reached for the nearest one. Crazy, she stands in the fire, so she is crazy. Ruth Kirtley came over Sunday afternoon with a covered dish and the news. Ruth was 54, built like a churn, and the kindest woman in the county, and she could not hold a piece of information any longer than a sieve holds water. "Emmett says to tell you, Prentice took his string south Saturday," Ruth said. "And he says to tell you if you want to catch him, you got till about Wednesday, and he'll likely give you your $9 back on account of he felt bad." "I don't want my $9 back." "Delia," Ruth set the dish down and put both hands on the table. "Honey, they're saying it in town." "Saying what?" "That you bought a burnt horse for $9, with 12 days on the guard order." Odette Prine said it at the Ladies' Aid in front of 11 women. She said, and I'm telling you exactly, she said, "That poor thing has gone strange out there alone, and somebody ought to write to her people in Ohio." "I don't have people in Ohio. I know it. I said so." She said, "Well, somebody ought to write to somebody." Ruth's mouth went flat. And then Sim Rathbone come in for coal oil, and he told the whole story about the smoke-crazy horse, and how you'd be plowing your guard with a spavined bay and a lap robe, and Pruitt laughed so hard he had to sit down on the flour. Delia poured the coffee. "Ruth," she said, "come out to the corral a minute." They went out. She had the fire laid ready in the middle of the pen from that morning, and she put a match to it and put green grass on and let it smoke, and she walked out and got Wick and led her into it, and dropped the rope, and then she came back and stood beside Ruth Kirtley at the rails, and neither of them said anything for about a minute and a half. Well, Ruth said at last, in a very small voice for a woman her size, "Yes, Delia, that horse is standing in a fire." "She is. They said she was afraid of fire." "They did." Ruth Kirtley looked at that mare a long time, and Delia watched her face do the thing she was going to watch a lot of faces do over the next month, which was to try 3 different explanations, and have all 3 of them fail. "What is she?" Ruth said finally. "I don't know yet. I know what she isn't." The ordinance had been passed by the Halloway County Board of Commissioners in the spring of 1882, 6 months after the Big Burn, and it was tacked up in 3 places in town and printed twice in the Halloway Sentinel, and everybody in the county could recite the shape of it, if not the words. Every occupant of land holding hay and stack, or a dwelling, or improvements, shall cause to be plowed a fire guard of not less than 4 furrows in width, said guard to be maintained free of growth, upon the boundary of such holding, on or before the 15th day of October in each year. Fine of not less than $50 for failure. And the part that mattered, the part that had teeth, any occupant not in compliance shall be liable in damages for any fire escaping from or crossing his premises, whether or not such fire originated with him. 2 miles of guard. 4 furrows out and 4 furrows back on a 14-inch walking plow, in sod that had been broken once 8 years ago and gone back half to buffalo grass, in ground that had taken 4 inches of rain since June and had set up like a wagon road. She started Monday morning at daylight on the 6th of October with 9 days left, and she put the sorrel mare and the spavined bay in the double harness side by side, because a walking plow in that ground is a 2-horse job, and there was no 3rd horse to be had for love or money in a county where every man alive was plowing his own guard the same week. Pilot went sour in an hour. He tried, and the hawks would not have it, and by 9 he was hopping the last 2 steps of every round, and Delia unhooked him, and turned him out and stood at the end of the furrow, with the sweat running down inside her collar, and looked at what was left. 1 horse. 9 days. 2 miles. A single horse cannot pull a 14-inch walking plow through 8 years' sod in a dry October. That is not an opinion. Every man in Halloway County would have told you so, and they would have been right about every horse in Halloway County. Delia set the plow shallow, 3 inches, no more than she needed to turn a bare strip that would not carry fire, and she took the double harness off and put wick in the singletree. And she wrapped the lines around her own back the way her father had done it in Illinois, and she said, "All right, get up." The mare leaned. She did not lunge into it, and she did not scrabble. She set her feet and put her chest into the collar and leaned, slow and level and enormous. And the plow point cracked into the sod, and Delia felt it come up through the handles into her shoulders like a thing tearing. And then the furrow started to roll off the moldboard in one long, unbroken brown ribbon, and the sorrel mare walked. She walked at the pace of a woman's stride, which is the whole art of it, and cannot be taught in a week. She held the line without a fence to follow. When Delia said gee, she came over a hand's width, not a foot. At the corners she pivoted on her hind legs, with the collar still loaded, and took the plow around square. She stopped when the point struck a buried cobble and stood, without being told, until Delia had backed the plow off it, and then took up the load again from a dead stop, which is the hardest single thing a draft animal is ever asked to do, and she did it 11 times that first day, and never once tried to jerk it. They made 410 rods that day. Delia measured it with a knotted string and paced it twice, because she did not believe it. That night she sat on the doorstone with her hands shaking too hard to hold the coffee cup, and she laughed until she had to press her apron against her mouth, and the sound of it went out over the divide, where there was nobody to hear it for 4 miles. By Wednesday, the story of it had got as far as the Sparta Road. Caleb Reams came by that afternoon with 6 mules and a load of pine and a ton of Trinidad coal, going from the railhead down to the county seat, and he pulled his outfit up at the top of the rise where the road crossed the corner of her section, and sat there on the wagon box for a good 3 minutes without getting down. He was 36, a freight teamster, sunburned in a band across the eyes from the hat, quiet in a way that some people took for slow, and that was not slow. He had hauled for her husband. He had brought the glass windows out from Sparta in 1879 and would not take money for the trip. He was the only man in the county who had come out to the place in the 20 months since the funeral and asked, once, plainly, if she needed anything hauled, and had accepted no for an answer without argument, and had come back and asked again in the spring. Delia was 3/4 of the way down the west line with the mare and the plow when she saw him, and she finished the round because you finished the round, and she came up to the road with the mare blowing easy beside her. Caleb, Mrs. Ruark. He came down off the wagon. He looked at the guard, the long, raw double strip of turned earth running away south along her line, straight as a rifle shot, and then he looked at the sorrel mare, and then he looked at the guard again, and he took his hat off and put it back on, which for Caleb Reams was a speech. How much of that's today? Since Monday. With her. With her. He walked around the mare. He did not touch her at first. He looked at the shoulders under the collar for galls, and there were none, and he looked at the feet, and he stood back and looked at the way she was standing, square in the road in the open with nothing behind her. Then he saw the hip. Delia, he said. He had not called her Delia in 20 months. Who'd you buy this horse off of? Amos Prentice. Off the canner string. $9. Do you know that brand? Connected Vo. Prentice didn't know it. I looked in the county book and it's not recorded in Halloway. It wouldn't be. Caleb Reams put his hand flat on the mare's hip beside the old iron mark, and there was something in his face she had not seen on it before. That's Ottis Vane's brand. That's the Vane O. And he told her who Ottis Vane was, which was a name that had meant something in that country before the railroad came in and took the long hauls away from men with mules. Vane had freighted for the army, south into the territory and west toward the mountains, from 1868, and there had not been a better set of stock on that side of the state. And he had bred his own out of a Percheron horse and heavy Kentucky mares, and Caleb Reams said he had never in his life put a hand on better pulling horses than the ones that carried that brand. Is he alive? He was 2 years ago. Caleb was quiet a second. He's at Wheatley's. The county farm, out past the salt flat, 22 miles. He lost his eyes. Cataracts. Both of them, come on fast in about 1.5 years, and he sold out the outfit, and there wasn't much left after, and he went out to Wheatley's in the spring of '82. I hauled his trunk out there myself. Delia Ruark stood in the road with her hand on the mare's neck and felt the whole shape of something she could not see, yet turn over once, the way a fish turns in muddy water. Caleb, he'd know her. He'd know her by name if he ever put that brand on her. He looked at the tipped ear. He'd know her by that. She went into town Thursday because she had to. She was out of coal oil and out of nails, and she needed a new plow point, and the plow point was the thing that finally forced it, because you cannot turn dry sod with a rounded share. Prine's store on a Thursday afternoon held 8 or 9 people, and every one of them stopped talking when the doorbell went. She got what she needed off the shelves and set it on the counter. Coal oil, 4 pounds of 8-penny nails, a plow point, a paper of needles, coffee. Odette Prine did the figuring. Odette was 40 and handsome in a hard way, and she ran the ledger for her brother. And she had wanted the Ruark quarter for her nephew for 3 years, and she had a voice pitch to carry to the back of a room while appearing to be aimed at the person in front of her. $2.60, Odette said. On the account? On the account. That'll bring you to $11.40 on the book, Mrs. Ruark. She wrote it in with great care. Of course it would have been $2.40 if you hadn't spent the 9. Somebody by the stove made a noise into his fist. The 9 spent, Delia said. So we hear. Everyone's heard. Odette blotted the page. I do hope she wasn't a disappointment. Sim says she's a picture standing still. He says she's very good at standing still. She's good at it. Well, I suppose that's something. A horse that stands still can't run off with you. Odette shut the ledger. There's a ladies' aid the 26th. We do like to see you, Delia. It isn't good for a woman to be so much alone. It makes a person peculiar, and there isn't a soul out there to tell her so. Delia picked up the plow point and put it under her arm. Odette, she said, how wide is your guard? The store got very quiet. I beg your pardon? Your guard. Your brother owns the 2 lots behind this building, and the lumber sheds and the hay barn on the east end of town. The ordinance says 4 furrows around any holding with hay and stack. I walked past your hay barn coming in. There is 6 tons of loose hay in that lot, and there is dry pigweed growing up against the boards 2 foot high, and there is no guard on the east side of it at all, and the wind has blown south for 3 weeks. Odette Prine's face did not move. That's town property. That's different. It says every occupant. It doesn't say every occupant outside the corporation line. Delia put her change in her apron. I only ask because the fine is the same for everybody, and because if a fire ever comes up out of that draw with a south wind behind it, the first thing it will reach in this town is that hay, and the second thing it will reach is this building, and I would not like to be the one who has to be told about it afterward. She went out. The bell rang behind her. She had made it 4 steps down the plank walk when the door opened again, and Josiah Kerr the blacksmith came out after her, with his apron still on. Mrs. Ruark. She stopped. I laughed at the pens, he said. Friday, I want to say I'm sorry for it, and I'd take it back. All right. That's all. He wiped his hands on the apron, and then didn't seem to know what to do with them. Fella says a thing and it goes on and he can't get hold of it again. I know it. That mare pulling? 400 rods a day. Josiah Kerr looked down the street toward the pens, where it had happened. And back. 400, he said. Single? Single, I'd like to see that sometime, he said, and went back in. Garrick Doyle came out to the place on Friday, the 10th of October. He came in a top buggy with a matched pair, and Sim Rathbone riding alongside on a good bay gelding. And Delia saw the dust of them from 1.5 miles off, and finished the round she was on and unhooked, and stood the mare in the shade of the barn before they got there, because she was not going to be found in the furrow with her hands full. Doyle was 58. He had come into that country in 1871 with 900 head and a note, and by 1884 he ran better than 4,000 on 11 sections that he owned outright, and about 30 more that he used and did not own, and he had bought 7 quarter sections off burned out and broke out homesteaders in 3 years, always for cash, always fair by the letter and never by the spirit. And there was not one man in Halloway County who could afford to be his enemy out loud. Mrs. Ruark. He did not get down. Rathbone did, and stood at the horses' heads. That's a good straight line of guard. Thank you. You've made it 2/3 around. About that. You won't finish it. Doyle said it kindly. That was the thing about him. He said the worst thing he had to say in the voice a man uses to tell you it looks like rain. 15th is Wednesday. That's 5 days. You've got the north line to do, and the north line is the hard side. That's where the old buffalo wallow ground is, and you're doing it with 1 horse. I've got a horse. You've got a $9 horse. He smiled. Now I don't say that to be hard. I say it because I have a proposition, and I would rather put it to you now than in November when you're worse off. I'll give you $600 for the quarter, the improvements, the tower, and the stock. Cash money, at the bank, Monday. You'd walk away clear of the note, and you'd have $360 in your hand, and you could go anywhere in this country and start over, and you'd be, forgive me, a young woman yet. Delia Ruark stood with her hand on the top rail of her own corral. It's worth more than $600. It's worth more than $600 to a man with 4 horses and 2 sons. It is worth $600 to you. He gathered the lines. Think on it. The offer stands to the 1st of November, and then it does not, because after the 1st of November the winter's on you, and I'd be buying a different thing." Rathbone got back on his bay. He looked past Delia at the sorrel mare standing loose in the shade of the barn, and he looked at the scars on her side a long moment. "That the burnt one?" he said. "That's her." "Huh," Sim Rathbone said. "Was you to ever want to sell her for what she'll bring? Chalk Bluff buys hides. The north line took 3 days, and it very nearly took the mare. The old buffalo wallow ground along the top of the divide is a thing you have to have plowed to understand. The bison had used those shallow basins for 10,000 years, rolling in them, packing them, and the ground under a wallow is not soil, it is a floor. It turns the point of a plow up like a spoon. There are stones in it the size of a man's head set in that packed clay as tight as brick and mortar, and there is one more thing in it that nobody warns you about, which is that the grass roots over a wallow grow in a mat 4 inches thick that a share does not cut, it tears. Delia Ruark plowed 1.1 miles of it in 3 days with 1 horse. She was up at 4 and out at first light, and she went until she could not see the furrow, and then for 2 of those nights she hung the lantern on the plow handle and went on until 11, walking behind a sorrel mare in the dark, on a divide with no light anywhere in the whole visible world except the 1 lamp and the stars. Her hands split across the palms on the 2nd day, and she wrapped them in strips off a flour sack and went on. She was sick twice from the heat on the 11th, standing at the end of the furrow with her hands on her knees, and then she straightened up and picked up the lines. She stopped every hour on the hour. That was the discipline she held to, and it was the only reason it worked. She unhooked and stripped the collar and went over the mare's shoulders with her bare hand for the first hot place, because a collar gall on a single horse in the middle of that would have ended it, and she rubbed the shoulders with cold water and a rag, and she let her stand 20 minutes, and then she hooked back up. She fed her 4 quarts of oats and all the hay she would eat, which was more hay than Delia could rightly spare, and one night she went out at 2 in the morning with a lantern to look at her, because she had woken up certain the mare was down, and Wick was standing in the middle of the corral asleep in the open, and she lifted her head and looked at the lantern, and went back to sleep. Wick lost weight. Anybody could see it by the 12th. Her flanks tucked, and the muscle over her hips stood out in a way it had not on the 3rd of October, and the pale scar country down her near side stretched a little tighter over the ribs beneath it. But her feet stayed cool, and her shoulders stayed clean, and every morning when Delia came out with the harness over her arm, that mare walked to the gate to meet her. She finished the north line at 4 in the afternoon on Monday, the 13th of October, 2 days ahead of the ordinance. 2 miles and 40 rods of guard, 4 furrows wide, all the way around 160 acres, cut by 1 woman and 1 $9 mare in 8 days. She sat down in the last furrow with her back against the plow beam, and cried for about 90 seconds, which was the first time she had cried since the funeral, and then she got up and washed her face at the trough and did the evening chores. Merritt Sallow came out at 10 the next morning. He was the county fire warden, a decent enough man with a bad back, and no talent for saying no to people who fed him dinner. Commissioner Vester Coyne came with him. Coyne was on the board of commissioners and had been for 6 years, and he had 300 head running on Chalk Bluff grass under an arrangement with Garrick Doyle that everybody knew about and nobody wrote down. They walked the west line and the south line and did not say much. At the northeast corner, where her guard came down off the divide and swung to follow the top edge of the hay meadow along Cutbank Draw, Vester Coyne stopped and got out a folded plat map. "There it is," he said. Sallow looked unhappy. "Vester, there it is, Merritt. Look at your map. Her guard leaves the section line right here and runs, 40 rods inside it, down around the meadow and back up. That is not on the boundary of the holding. The ordinance says upon the boundary. That's 160 rods of her northeast boundary, with no guard on it at all. Delia had come up behind them. There is no hay on that 160 rods, she said. There is nothing on it but shortgrass and a rock ledge. The hay is in the meadow, and the guard is around the meadow. Ordinance doesn't say around your hay, ma'am, says upon the boundary of the holding. Then read it out loud, Mr. Coyne. Coyne's chin came up. I have it here. Delia took the folded page out of her apron pocket. It was the Halloway Sentinel of the 22nd of April, 1882, gone soft as cloth at the folds. She had cut it out and kept it, and she read it in a flat, clear voice, standing in her own furrow. Every occupant of land holding hay and stack, or a dwelling, or improvements, shall cause to be plowed a fire guard of not less than 4 furrows in width, said guard to be maintained free of growth, upon the boundary of such holding. She folded it. The dwelling and the improvements are inside my guard. The hay and stack is inside my guard. The boundary of the holding that is at issue is the boundary of the holding that holds something, and there is not a court in this state that would read it your way. Because if it read your way, then Pruitt Prine is out of compliance on 4 town lots, and Chalk Bluff is out of compliance on 11 sections. Because I have ridden past your east line, Mr. Coyne, and there is 1 furrow on it in places, and none at all across the Sparta Road. The wind came up the draw and moved the grass. Merritt Sallow looked at his boots. That's the ranch's business, Coyne said. It's the same ordinance, Mrs. Ruark. Coyne folded up his plat map slow and careful. I'm going to write it up not in compliance. You've got the right to appeal it to the board at the November meeting. Fine's $50, and it goes on the tax roll. You've got 10 days from today, that's the 24th, to plow the northeast boundary as I've marked it, and if it's plowed I'll come out and take the write-up off myself. With 1 horse. That's not my lookout, ma'am. Everybody in this county's got the same ordinance, and everybody in this county got it done. Everybody in this county has 4 horses and 2 hired men. Then, maybe, Vester Coyne said, and he said it looking straight at her, a person situated as you are situated ought to consider whether they're situated right. Merritt Sallow said, on the way to the buggy, quietly, not looking at her, for what it's worth I'd have passed it. That's a better guard than mine. Then why didn't you? Because I'm not the board, Sallow said, and I've got a bad back and 11 years to my pension, and he got in the buggy. And Delia Ruark thought, that is how a whole county gets burned down, 1 reasonable man at a time. The $50 went on the tax roll on the 16th. It was more than 5 times what the mare had cost. It was, to a woman with $11.40 on Prine's book, and $240 coming due at the bank in March, a wall. She went to the bank on the 17th, and Ansel Fitch was very sorry. He was sorry in his hands and his eyebrows and the set of his shoulders, and he was sorry for 6 or 7 minutes, without once saying a word that meant anything. The note's a demand note, Mrs. Ruark. I'd renew it, if it were mine to renew. Times have changed since Tom sat in that chair. It was renewed in March. It was. And it was renewed on the strength of a cattle market that has since dropped $14 a head. He aligned 2 papers that did not need aligning. I will tell you plainly because you'll hear it anyway. The bank has been carrying more paper than it can carry, and some of it has been placed with private parties, yours among them. Delia sat very still. Placed with who? I'm not at liberty. Ansel Fitch looked at the window. Chalk Bluff Cattle Company holds your note as of Tuesday, he said. It's a demand note, Mrs. Ruark. It always was. Nothing's changed in the instrument. What's changed is whose desk it sits on. By the 18th, the story had got its final shape in town, the shape it would keep right up until the 27th, and the shape was this. The Ruark woman out on the divide had gone strange. She had spent her last $9 on a horse the hide man was going to boil, and the horse was scared of fire, and she had plowed her guard wrong. And the county had fined her $50 she did not have, and Chalk Bluff had her note, and Garrick Doyle had offered her $700 for the place, which was $100 more than the first offer, and was, everybody agreed, generous. They did not say it meanly, most of them. That is the part people get wrong when they tell this story now. Only 2 or 3 said it meanly. The rest of them said it the way you talk about weather, with a shake of the head, as a thing that was simply happening and that nobody was doing. On the evening of the 18th, Caleb Reams pulled his outfit into her yard on his way back, empty from the county seat, and found her sitting on the doorstone in the dark, with the lamp not lit. He sat down on the wagon tongue. "Sallow's a coward," he said. "He is. Coins bought. He is. You going to take the $700? Delia Ruark looked out at the corral, where a sorrel mare stood asleep in the open middle of it, under the stars. "Caleb," she said. "How far is Wheatley's?" 22 miles. Northwest, past the salt flat, roads bad the last 6. Can I get there and back in a day with the wagon? Not and do anything when you get there." He was quiet. You'd want to go up one day and come back the next. You'd want somebody to know where you were. "Then you know where I am," she said. She left at 4 in the morning on the 20th of October, with the sorrel mare and the pony in the double, a sack of oats, 2 loaves, a quart of coal oil for the old man, and Amos Prentice's bill of sale folded in her apron pocket. The road northwest ran 12 miles of good shortgrass, and then dropped onto the salt flat, 4 miles of white hardpan, with a rim of dead alkali grass around it, and not one living thing standing on it taller than a man's boot. And then it climbed again into broken country, where the last 6 miles were less a road than a memory of one. She got to Wheatley's at 2 in the afternoon. The Halloway County Poor Farm was a half section with a long, low-frame building painted once, a garden, a hog lot, and dug back into the south slope behind it. 4 dugouts with stovepipes coming out of the sod for the men who would not sleep inside a building. Mrs. Wheatley was the superintendent's wife and ran the whole of it, and there were 19 people on the place that fall. And she knew every one of their names and every one of their histories, and she had the flat, unsurprised manner of a woman who has stopped being shocked by the arithmetic of how people end up. "Otis Vane," she said. "3rd dugout. He's awake. He's always awake." She looked past Delia at the wagon. "Is that team yours?" "The sorrel is." "Then don't tie her out of his hearing," Mrs. Wheatley said, "because he's not going to believe a word you say till he gets his hands on something." Delia unhitched the sorrel mare and led her around the end of the building. The dugout had a plank door standing open to the light and a bench outside it, and on the bench sat an old man in a canvas coat with his hat on, facing exactly south, into the sun, with his hands on his knees. He was 74. He was a big framed man gone thin, with white stubble and a nose that had been broken, and a pair of eyes that were open and clear-lidded, and had over each pupil a disc the color of skim milk. He turned his head when he heard the boots, and then he turned it again, further, past her, and he came up off the bench so fast his hat fell off. "That's a shod horse walking," he said. "Who's that on the near side? Who's that walking?" "My name is Delia Ruark, Mr. Vane. I've brought a mare I bought off a hide buyer for $9, and I'd like you to tell me what she is." Otis Vane came across the dooryard with both hands out in front of him, at the level of a horse's head, and his boots found the ground without looking for it, and he came straight to the mare as if he could see her, because he had heard exactly where she stopped. His hands landed on her face. He went over her like a man reading. The blaze, thumb tracing the width of it. The nostrils. The teeth lip lifted, one finger on the corner incisor, counting up the near cheek, over the pole, and then his right hand went out along the crest and found the mane on the near side, the short, stiff, ragged brush of it, and stopped. Then he found the ear. He took that tipped left ear in his whole hand and folded it and felt the healed bend in the top of it, and Otis Vane made a sound Delia Ruark never forgot, which was not a word. "Hold still," he said to the mare, in a voice that had gone to pieces. "Hold still now, hold still." He worked back along the neck to the shoulder and down the near side, and his hands went into the country of pale skin, and he stopped moving them, and just laid both palms flat on it, and he stood like that, a blind old man in a poor farm dooryard, with both hands on a horse's ribs, for as long as it takes to count to 40. "Charity," he said. "Sir, her name is Charity." Foaled the 8th of May, 1875, out of a mare called Bess, by a Percheron horse I bought in Junction City, with a bad eye and a great heart. She was the 4th foal out of that mare, and the only one I kept entire in my mind, if you take my meaning. I put the VO on her hip myself in the spring of '76 with my own iron, and I burned it light because she was a good filly, and I didn't want to mark her hard. His hands had not come off her side. Tell me who had her. Amos Prentice had her, a hide buyer. He got her for nothing off a man in Sparta. For nothing. He said she was worthless. He said she was smoke crazy. The old man's head came around. Say that again. They say she's afraid of fire. They say she won't lead past a branding fire and can't be trusted at a burn-off, and she's ruined and she'd spook when it counted. Delia heard her own voice go unsteady and could not stop it. "Mr. Vane, it isn't true. I've stood her in smoke. She walks into it. She sleeps in the middle of a corral with her back to nothing. I have never seen a horse like her in my life, and every man in my county laughed at me for $9, and I need somebody to tell me what I've got." Otis Vane began to laugh, and then he stopped laughing, and he put one hand up over the milky eyes and stood there. "Ma'am," he said. "Ma'am, I made her that way." They sat on the bench in the sun, and he told it. He had freighted out of that country from 1868, hauling for the army posts south into the territory and west toward the mountains, before the railroad came in and took the long hauls away from men with mules. Every fall the whole plains burned. Some of it was set on purpose, by ranchers burning off, by the Indians the way they had always done, by section crews clearing a right-of-way. Some of it came off a locomotive stack or a careless camp. It did not matter which. If you moved freight across the shortgrass in October, you were going to meet fire. And the thing about fire on that country is that it does not come at you like weather. It comes at you like an animal, low and fast, and the whole front of it can travel faster than a loaded wagon can turn around. In October of 1877, Otis Vane lost 4 mules, 2 wagons, and $1,100 of government freight on the divide north of the Cimarron. And he lost them because his stock went insane in the smoke and ran into the fire instead of out of it. Which is what stock does, because a horse will run from what it can see, and the smoke takes the seeing away, and then the horse runs on nothing but. Panic, and panic has no direction in it. He walked out of that with his hands burned and his hair gone, and 1 mule. And then he did the thing that made him, in the judgment of most men who knew him, a crank, and made him, in the end, the only man on that side of the state who never lost stock to a fire again. He set out to build a horse that would stand. "You can't take fear out of a horse," Otis Vane said. "Anybody tells you they took the fear out of a horse is lying to you or selling you something. What you do is you put something else in on top of it that is stronger than the fear, and the only thing there is that stronger is habit. Habit and a hand she trusts. That's all there is. 3 years of it. He told her the method the way a man recites a thing he has said in his head 10,000 times. He started her at 90 days old, at feeding time, with a smudge, a handful of green grass on a coal in a bucket, set 40 feet from the feed pan, so that the first thing she ever knew about smoke was that it came with supper. Every day he moved the bucket 1 handspan closer, not a foot, a handspan. 30 days to move it 15 feet, and if she ever quit eating, he moved it back 3 feet, and started again from there, and lost a week, and did not care. At a year he began the hood. He made it himself out of soft calfskin, a blind that buckled behind the ears and came down over both eyes and left the nostrils and the mouth clear, and he taught her that the hood meant hands. Hood on, and she could not see, and the only thing in the world was his hand on her jaw and his voice, and he led her over ground she had never walked, through brush, over a plank, into a shed, out again, and every single time the hood came off there was grain. 2 years of the hood. At 2 he started the word. Stand, Otis Vane said. Not whoa. Whoa is for stopping, and every horse in the world knows whoa, and it don't mean but a second and a half. Stand is a different word, and it's the only one I ever taught her that mattered. Stand means you are going to be here when I come back, and there is nothing in creation that is going to move you off this ground. And it takes a year to build, and you build it in the barn where nothing's happening, 10 minutes at a time, in the cold, and in the dark, and in the rain, until it's in her bones. At 3, he put her in fire. Real fire. Controlled, in a plowed strip, with 2 men and wet sacks, and the wind measured, and he stood her in the burned ground, and let a strip of grass go up 8 feet from her nose, while she wore the hood, and he stood at her jaw with his hand under it, and said the word. And the first year she trembled so hard he could feel it in his boots through the ground, and she did not move her feet. And the second year she quit trembling. I had 5 horses I could put in smoke, he said. I had 2 would go into it. I had 1 that would stand in it. She's sitting out there in your harness. And the fall of 81, Delia said. The old man's hands went still on his knees. 12 miles east of the Salt, he said. The 7th of October, 1881, about 4 in the afternoon. Wind out of the south at 30, and it had been dry since the middle of July. It come up over the divide behind us with a mile of front on it, and we could not outrun it with 4 loaded wagons, and there was no water inside of 6 miles. So we done the only thing there is, he said. We backfired. They lit a strip on the lee side and let it run away from them with the wind. And it left behind it a piece of black ground about 80 yards across, and burnt ground is the only safe place in the world when a front comes, because there is nothing left standing on it to burn. That part any teamster in the country knew. The part nobody knew was what came next, because getting stock onto black ground is one problem, and keeping it there is another. And a man can hold 1 horse in a fire front for perhaps a minute, and he cannot hold 2, and he cannot hold 1 for 4 minutes. So they picketed the whole outfit off the Mare. 4 mules and 2 horses on a single line, the line made fast to her rig, and the sorrel standing in the middle of that black ground, with the calfskin hood buckled over her eyes, and an old man's hand under her jaw. It came over at 4:15. A fire front does not arrive. It breaks, the way a wave breaks. There is a wind that sucks in under the face of it, hard enough to take a hat off a man, and then a noise, and then the front stands up 20 feet high and goes past, and the heat comes off the flank of it like the open door of a forge. It took the paint off 2 of the wagons. The mules went up in the air and came down and went up again for 4 solid minutes, and every one of them was hung on that line, and that line was hung on her. She stood. It went by on her near side, and it did to her what it did, and Otis Vane felt her drop 4 inches in the shoulders, and set herself lower and stay. He had his hand under her jaw, and he was saying the word over and over into the roar of it, and he told Delia Ruark that afternoon on the bench that he did not know then, and did not know now whether that mare heard one syllable of it. She could not see. She could not smell anything but the burning. She had nothing left in the world to go on, except a thing she had been told every day since she was 90 days old, which was that if she stood still, a man would come and take the hood off. When it had gone by, he took the hood off, and she looked at him. 6 head of stock alive on that black ground, Ottisfane said, and 4 wagons, and 3 men. There is a woman in Dodge City today with grandchildren because her father come home off that road. She don't know the name of the horse that done it, and there ain't no reason she should. He had lost her the way men lose everything, which is slowly and then all at once. The cataracts came on in the winter of 1880, and by the summer of 1881 he was reading a waybill by holding it at the end of his arm in full sun, and by the spring of 1882 he could tell a window from a wall and nothing else. A blind man does not run freight. He sold the outfit at Sparta in April of that year, wagons, harness, mules, and every horse but her. And he gave her, free and outright with a written bill, to a man named Hobart Sneed, who had hauled with him 9 years, and who had held the wet sacks on the black ground in 81, and who understood exactly what she was. Hobart Sneed died of a burst appendix 14 months later, in June of 1883, and his widow sold the stock off the place in a week because she was going back to Missouri and could not wait, and the sorrel mare with the scarred side went for $30 to a man who wanted a plow horse. After that she went down the way an animal goes down when nobody knows what it is. The plow horse man sold her that fall because she would not shy off a burning brush pile, and he decided she was dull. The next man used her a season and traded her because she stood in the smoke of a branding fire, and he decided she was dumb. The next man in Sparta had her 3 months and said she was smoke crazy, which was the sentence that finally stuck to her, because it was the first one that sounded like an explanation, and men will always take an explanation over a question. He gave her to Amos Prentice for nothing in September of 1884, and Amos Prentice put her on the beam scale and wrote down 940 pounds, and that is how she came to be standing against a plank fence in the shade at Halloway on the 3rd of October watching the branding smoke go by. 2 years and 5 months, Ottisfane said. 4 men. Not one of them ever asked one single question. They had it in front of them every day. He would not let Delia leave until 3 things were done. The first was the hood. He went into the dugout and came out with a flour sack, and inside the flour sack was a soft calfskin blind, oiled black with handling, the buckle worn bright. And he put it in her hands. That's hers. I got no business with it, and I've had it under my bed 2 years. The second was the words. He made her say them until he was satisfied. Stand, low, from the chest, not loud. A short whistle through the teeth that meant come to my hand. A hand flat under the jaw, and the flat of the hand never leaves the jaw while she is hooded, because the hand is the whole world when the eyes are gone. You do not say stand and walk off and go do something else, Ottisfane said. Not ever. Not once. You say stand, you stay where she can feel you or hear you, and you come back for her. You break that one time and you have broke the whole thing, and you will not build it back in a year. And while she was harnessing to go, he told her one more thing, standing at the mare's head with his hand on the jaw. And he told it the way a man tells you where the well is, as a plain fact of no particular importance. You ever have to prove where a fire come from? Ottisfane said. You go out on the black and look at the grass stems. Fire lays the stubble over. It don't lay it over the way it run. It lays it back against the way it run, because the flame leans into the wind that's feeding it. You walk a burn-reading stubble, and it will point you back upwind to the head of it, every rod of the way, right to the spot where somebody put the match down. Any freighter knows it. No lawyer knows it. I have settled 2 arguments with it and never lost either one. How far back does it hold, as far as the burn goes? Grass don't lie, ma'am. Grass ain't got any interest in the outcome. The third was the paper. Mrs. Wheatley wrote it out at the long table in the frame building with a steel pen while the old man dictated it, and Delia Ruark signed as a witness, and Mrs. Wheatley signed as a witness, and the superintendent came in from the hog lot and signed too. And the whole of it took 40 minutes because Otis Vane wanted the dates right. That he, Otis Vane, formerly of Sparta in this state, freighter, did breed and raise a sorrel mare foaled the 8th of May, 1875, out of the mare Bess, and did brand her with a connected V and O upon the left hip in the spring of 1876, said mare having a white blaze, 1 white sock upon the left hind, and the top of the left ear healed folded from a wire cut taken as a yearling. That he did over a period of 3 years' train, said mare to stand to fire and smoke without moving, by daily habituation, and by the use of a blind hood, for the purpose of holding stock upon burnt ground in a prairie fire. That said, mare did so stand upon the 7th of October, 1881. Upon the divide east of the salt flat, and did hold 6 head of stock upon backfired ground, while the front of a fire passed, and did take the scarring upon her near side thereby. That any report that said mare is afraid of fire, or is smoke crazy, or is unsound in her disposition, is false, and is the exact opposite of the fact, and the man who says it is describing the finest piece of work I ever done in my life, and calling it a defect. Delia read it back to him twice. "Would you say that in front of the county board?" she asked. "Or a court?" "Ma'am," Otis Vane said, "you send a wagon and I will say it in front of God." She got home at noon on the 21st with the paper in her apron and the hood in the flour sack on the seat beside her, and there were 3 days left to plow the 160 rods the county had marked, and she went out at 1 o'clock and started. She finished it at 8 in the evening on the 23rd. Merritt Sallow came out on the 24th and walked it and said it was in compliance, and wrote it up so, and the $50 stayed on the tax roll anyway, because the fine had been assessed for the condition as it stood on the 15th, and there was no provision in the ordinance for taking one off, which Vester Coyne had known perfectly well when he made the offer. Then she began working the mare with fire in the open, in daylight, where the Sparta road came over the rise, and everybody going by could see her. She did not do it to make a point. She did it because Otis Vane had told her that 2.5 years of nothing will rust anything, and because a woman with 1 horse and a $50 fine and a note held by a man who wanted her land had exactly 1 asset in the world, and she meant to know its edges. She built smudge fires in the middle of the plowed guard, where nothing could carry. She hooded the mare and led her over ground she did not know, up onto the wagon, through the barn, around the tower. She stood her and walked 40 feet away and stood still herself in her line of hearing and counted to 200 and came back and did it again and again. She said the word 10 times a day in the barn in the dark where nothing was happening. And the county drove past on the Sparta road and looked at a widow woman in a blue dress lighting fires on the divide in the driest October in 6 years with a hood over her horse's eyes, and the county came to a conclusion. The Halloway Sentinel of the 24th of October, 1884, carried 9 lines at the bottom of the 3rd column, unsigned. Under the head A novel system of husbandry, it is reported from the Two Wells divide that a certain lady of our county, having invested her substance in a horse rejected by the hide trade, is now engaged in the instruction of the animal by means of bonfires, a practice which we trust she will confine to her own premises, the season being what it is. The Board of Commissioners might profitably inquire, Odette Prine read it aloud at the Ladies' Aid on the 26th, and Ruth Kirtley stood up in the middle of it and said, "Odette, I have seen that horse stand in the smoke, and I would not laugh at her if I was you." And Odette said, "Ruth, sit down. Nobody is laughing," in a room where 11 women were laughing. Garrick Doyle wrote her on the 22nd. It was a short letter and a courteous one. Chalk Bluff Cattle Company had acquired her note of $240 from the Halloway County Bank, the note being payable on demand. Demand was hereby made. Payable at the company office within 30 days. That is by the 21st of November. The company's offer of $700 for the quarter section and improvements remained open until the 1st of November and would be applied against the note at her election. Caleb Reams lost the Chalk Bluff freight on the 23rd. He had hauled their coal and their posts and their winter flour for 5 years, and it was a third of his year's work. And Sim Rathbone told him at the loading dock at Sparta, pleasantly, that the company had made other arrangements. Caleb hauled a load of pine out to the Ruark place that same evening and stacked it by her barn and would not say what it was for and would not take money for it, and on the way out he said the only thing he said about any of it, which was, "I've hauled for worse people than you and been paid worse." The cattle came across her guard on the night of the 25th. 300 head of Chalk Bluff steers drifted down off the divide through her north wire in the dark, watered in her draw, and walked the length of her east guard 4 and 5 abreast. And by morning 1.25 miles of 4 furrow guard was a packed cattle trail, with the loose earth trodden flat and dry grass and manure, and tracked in stubble, filling the furrows from end to end. And a chain had been dragged behind a horse down the last 40 rods of it, which cattle do not do, and the marks of it were plain in the dust. And Delia Ruark stood and looked at those marks for a long time, in the gray light of the 26th of October. The plow was in the shed, with the beam split from the standard to the handle brace, where somebody had put a rock under it and driven a wagon wheel over it. She got out Tom's brace and bit, and 2 carriage bolts, and a strap of wagon iron, and she splinted that beam herself, standing in the shed, and it took her until 2 in the afternoon, and it was not a repair a blacksmith would have signed his name to, and it held. She plowed until dark on the 26th, and got 40 rods of the east guard opened up again out of 1.25 miles. That night the wind, which had blown out of the south for 31 days, backed around and freshened, and she came out at 10 o'clock in her nightdress, with a shawl over her shoulders, and stood in the dooryard with her hair loose, and felt it on her face, and did not go back to sleep. The 27th of October, 1884, came up hot. It was 71 degrees at 7 in the morning, and it was 81 by 10 in the last week of October, on ground that had taken 4 inches of rain since the middle of June. The wind had come around into the southwest in the night, and by 9 o'clock it was blowing a steady 30 with gusts in it that laid the grass flat in long running streaks 1/4 mile across, and the air had gone so dry that a wool sleeve crackled when you pushed it up. Every stockman in Halloway County knew what kind of day it was. That is the thing that has to be understood about what happened, and it is why the jury found the way it found. It was not a secret. The Sentinel had run the weatherglass reading on the front page for 4 days. Merritt Sallow had ridden to 11 places on the 24th, telling people not to burn. At about 10:30 in the morning, on the east pasture of the Chalk Bluff Cattle Company, 4 men under Sim Rathbone put fire into a section of old grass to burn it off for the spring. There is no argument about that. Rathbone admitted it inside of an hour and never took it back. Because 5 men saw the smoke go up, and 2 of them saw the crew, and because he did not think that morning that there was anything to admit. Burning off is what you do. He had a 2-furrow guard on the lee side of it, and a water barrel on a wagon, and 4 men with wet sacks, and he had burned off in that pasture 8 times. And the difference between the 8 times and this time was that the 8 times the wind had been under 15. The strip they lit ran 50 yards and jumped the 2 furrow guard in less than a minute, because in a 30-mile wind a shortgrass fire does not creep across a guard. It throws a rain of burning grass seed and cow chip ash 200 feet out ahead of itself. And it lands in cured buffalo grass, and it starts again, and it does that whether the guard is 2 furrows, or 4 or 10, if there is nobody standing on the far side of it, with a wet sack for every foot of the line. By 11 o'clock the head of that fire was 1.5 miles wide. By noon it had crossed 6 miles of open range on a course a little east of north, and the smoke was standing up off it in a brown wall you could see from the courthouse steps in Halloway, and the birds had come over the town ahead of it, meadowlarks and longspurs, and every prairie chicken on the divide, low and fast, and going the same way. Delia Ruark smelled it at 20 minutes to 11. She was in the hay meadow with a fork. She stood up and turned her face into the wind the way her horse did, and she smelled cured grass burning, and she looked south and there was nothing to see yet, and she went to the barn at a dead run. She had the harness on the mare by 5 minutes to 11. What she did next was arithmetic, and she did it standing in the barn door with a collar in her hands, and it was the whole of the thing, and she had about 90 seconds to do it in. The fire was coming out of the southwest. Her own guard, 4 furrows, freshly cut and clean, ran unbroken around 3 sides of her place. The 4th side, the east, was 1.25 miles of trodden cattle trail, with the furrows filled, and 40 rods of that had been reopened the evening before. If she stayed, she could probably hold her own place. Backfire off the west guard, stand in the black, keep the soddy and the barn and the stock. That was the sane thing, and any man in the county would have told her to do it. But the fire was not going to stop at her line. Her line was 160 acres in 12 miles of open grass. Past her north wire the shortgrass ran unbroken and unplowed down the long fall of the divide to the head of Cutbank Draw, and up the far side of the draw, and out onto the flat where the Sparta Road came in, and the first thing standing on that flat was Pruitt Prine's hay lot, with 6 ton of loose hay in it, and dry pigweed 2 foot high against the boards. And behind the hay lot were the lumber sheds, and behind the lumber sheds, in one continuous run of frame buildings with wooden awnings, was the whole east end of the town of Halloway. Nobody had plowed the head of Cutbank Draw, because nobody owned it. It was school land. It was the natural gate through which anything coming off the divide would arrive, and there were 400 people on the other side of it. Delia Ruark put the collar on the sorrel mare, and buckled the hames, and hooked the splinted plow, and did not go to her own east line at all. She went north. She left her house standing in the path of a fire, and drove her horse 1.75 miles at a trot down the wagon track to the head of the draw, with a wet grain sack, a canteen, a box of matches, and a calfskin hood on the seat beside her. There were already men there when she came. Josiah Kerr had come out from town with his forge wagon and 2 horses. Emmett Kirtley was there with a team and a lister. Sig Halvorson and his brother. Merritt Sallow, 9 or 10 more, and by 12:30 there were 30. And every one of them had come to do the only thing there was to do, which was to open a strip of bare ground across the head of that draw before the fire got there, and burn off the grass between the strip and the fire, and stand on it. And not one of them could get a team to face it. That is what people forget when they tell this story. The men of Halloway County were not cowards, and they did not stand around. They tried for better than an hour, and the smoke came up the draw ahead of the fire in a rolling gray flood that took the sight out of the world at 40 feet, and their horses went out of their minds. A horse in smoke is not a frightened horse. A frightened horse can still be worked. A horse in smoke has lost the one sense it navigates by, and it is not receiving instructions any longer from anything. and 30 men on the head of Cutbank Draw found that out inside of 10 minutes. Emmett Kirtley's team went over backward in the harness and broke a doubletree, and Emmett went down under a horse and came out with his collarbone snapped. The Halvorsen brothers got 160 rods opened, and then their off-horse went through the wire and took the near one with it, and both of them ran 3 miles with the lister banging behind, and were found the next day standing in the salt trough with the harness in ribbons. Josiah Kerr's pair simply stopped, dead 40 feet into the smoke, and stood shaking, with their heads jammed together, and could not be moved forward by any means known to a man who had shod horses for 22 years, and when he tried the whip, they went straight backward and put his forge wagon in the ditch. By 1:45, there was one plow moving on the head of Cutbank Draw. She hooded the mare on the lee side of the wagon, while the men were still shouting at their teams. She buckled it behind the ears, and put her hand flat under the jaw and held it there, and said the word. Then she picked up the lines and walked into it. Afterward, 26 men signed a statement about what they saw, and no 2 of them described it the same way. But every single one of them put down some version of the same 3 facts. That the smoke was so thick they lost sight of her inside of a minute, that they could hear the plow, and that she came back out of it going the other way, and turned at the end, and went in again. She cut 1,100 rods that afternoon, 3.5 miles of furrow across the head of Cutbank Draw, and out onto the flat, 4 and 6 furrows wide where she had time, and 2 where she did not, in 1 hour and 40 minutes, and the men who could not hold their own teams followed her on foot along the open ground behind her with wet sacks and beat out the sparks that came down in her furrow. And they said the smoke was worse 10 feet up than at the ground, and Josiah Kerr said that when he got up beside the mare's head to see if the woman needed help, he saw a hooded horse walking with her nose out and her ears loose at the speed of a woman's stride, and that he took hold of the hamestrap and walked along beside her for a while because he wanted to be next to it. At 2 o'clock, Merritt Sallow put fire into the grass on the south side of her furrow and let it burn back down the draw against the wind, and that is the backfire, and it is the only real weapon there has ever been against a prairie fire, and you cannot light one until you have a line to light it from. They had a line because a $9 horse had cut them one. The head of the fire came into the draw at 3:20. It came the way Otis Vane had described it, and the way nobody believes until they have seen it. There was a wind that ran out ahead of it and sucked in against the face of it and took Sig Halvorsen's hat and a man's coat off a wagon seat. There was a noise, which people always describe as a train, and which is nothing like a train, being both lower and more alive. And then the front of it stood up out of the draw 12 and 15 feet high, running north on 1.5 miles of face, and hit 300 yards of burnt black ground and 1,100 rods of raw plowed earth, and had nothing to eat. It went out along her line the way a wave goes flat on a beach. It threw sparks 200 feet over, and 30 men and 1 woman beat them out in the furrows with wet sacks for 40 minutes, and in 2 places it got over and got going in the pigweed, and they put it out with barrels and shovels and the sides of their coats, and by 4:30 on the 27th of October, 1884, the fire on the north side of Cutbank Draw was dead, and the town of Halloway was standing. Behind them, to the south, the burn ran back over 60,000 acres of the finest shortgrass in that part of the state. It took Chalk Bluff's east pasture and its middle pasture. It took 9 miles of the company's fence and the posts out of the ground. It took Vester Coyne's whole summer hay. It took the northeast corner of the Ruark quarter, the 1.25 miles of trodden cattle trail, where a guard had been filled in with a chain on the night of the 25th, and it came in through that gap and burned 40 acres of her hay meadow and stopped at her west guard 11 feet from the corner of her barn. And at 4:45, when the smoke had thinned enough to see 2 miles, somebody on the high ground put a glass on the south and said, in a voice that changed the whole shape of that afternoon, "There's men alive at the Chalk Bluff Hay Camp." The Chalk Bluff Hay Camp sat 3 miles south in a shallow bend where the company cut and stacked 600 tons of wild hay every August. And it had a camp house and a cook shed and a pole corral, and on the 27th of October, it had 22 head of the company's remuda in that corral and 5 men in it, because they had ridden down to fight the fire off the hay and had been too late to do anything but get in behind the stacks and lie flat while it went over. The fire had gone around them. That happens. A head fire running on 1.5 miles of face is not a solid wall, and where the ground dips and the grass thins, the front breaks and rejoins, and it had broken at the hay camp and rejoined a 1/2 mile north of it and left, in the middle of 60,000 acres of black, an island of unburned grass about 80 acres across with a camp and a corral and 600 tons of hay standing on it. At 5 o'clock the wind dropped and swung, the way it does at evening, and started to come back out of the north. That put fire on the north edge of the island, backing down into it slowly, against what wind there was, which is the slowest and most patient kind of fire there is, and the hardest to stop, and it was 200 yards from the first stack, and it had all night to get there. They could not get the horses out. They had tried for an hour before anybody in the north even knew they were alive. The only way off that island was 400 yards northeast across ground that was black and still smoking, with the wind laying a low sheet of smoke over it out of the burning edge, and there was not one horse in that corral that would go into it. They led them singly, and the horses hung back and reared and broke away. They blindfolded them with saddle blankets and got 2 of them 50 feet and lost them both. They tried to drive them in a bunch, and the bunch broke and came back and ran the corral fence down, and had to be gathered again in the dark by men on foot. A horse will not walk into smoke. That was the beginning of Otis Vane's life's work, and the end of 5 men's afternoon. Delia Ruark rode down there at 5:30 on the sorrel mare, with the calfskin hood over her arm. She rode her bareback with a halter and a lead because there was no time to hunt a saddle, and the last of the light was going red and brown through the smoke. And 30 men stood on the north lip of the burn and watched a woman in a blue dress with her hem black to the knee ride a hooded horse out onto the black ground, and Caleb Reams, who had come out from Sparta at 3 with his mules and a water barrel, walked out onto it after her and did not go back. The 5 men at the camp were Garrick Doyle, Sim Rathbone, 2 hands named Willis and Ott McRae, and a Chalk Bluff cook of 61 named Peter Lunt, who had been badly frightened and had gone very quiet. Doyle came out to meet her at the corral gate. His coat was gone, and his hat was gone, and his eyebrows were singed off, and there was a 2-inch burn hole in his shirt over the shoulder. And he stood in front of the woman whose note he was holding, and whose land he had offered $700 for. And he did not say any of the things a man of his standing might have found to say. "Mrs. Ruark," he said, "we can't move them." "How many?" 22, and 5 men. "Have you got picket rope?" "We've got 400 feet of it." "Then get it," Delia said, "and get every man that can stand and tie them head to tail in 3 strings, and tie every string to this mare's rig. And do not tie any of it to anything I cannot cut." Sim Rathbone said, "That's the burnt mare." "It is." "That mare won't lead us, Sim." Garrick Doyle said, "Get the rope." They strung them the way freighters had strung stock on that plains for 30 years, and the way one blind old man on a county poor farm had strung 6 head on black ground 3 years before. 8 and 7 and 7, head to tail, and all 3 strings brought forward, and made fast to a spreader on the mare's harness. And Delia went down the line with her knife open, and showed each man where to cut if a string went down, and made every one of them say it back. Then she buckled the hood over the sorrel mare's eyes in the last of the daylight, and put her hand flat under the jaw and left it there. "Stand," she said. She did not ride her. She walked at her head, on the near side, on the scarred side, with her left hand under the jaw and the lead in her right, and her whole arm against the mare's cheek, and Caleb Reams walked at the shoulder with a wet sack. And 5 men walked back along that line in the dark with wet sacks and the fear of God on them, and Peter Lunt the cook held the tail of the last horse in the 3rd string with both hands and his eyes shut, and was led out that way, and never was ashamed of it. It took 35 minutes to walk 400 yards. The mare walked at the speed of a woman's stride. She could not see. The smoke came over the black ground out of the backing edge in a low sheet that a man could not stand up in, and there was heat coming up out of the ground itself through her feet, and there were cow chips burning red in the ash all around her like coals in a grate, and behind her 22 horses were fighting that line the entire way, sitting back on it, going up, coming down, screaming, and every pound of that was coming through the spreader into her chest and her shoulders. Twice she stopped. Both times she stopped on her own, and both times Delia felt the reason a half-second later, which was a hot place in the ground ahead, and both times the mare came around a little to the east on her own and went on, and Delia Ruark said afterward, to the county board, and to a courtroom, and once to a newspaperman from Topeka, that she did not steer that horse. She said the only thing she did for 35 minutes was keep her hand under the jaw and say the word, and she said it maybe 400 times. They came up onto the green ground at the north lip of the burn at 20 minutes past 6 in full dark, into the light of 11 lanterns and 30 men, and the first thing the sorrel Mare did when the lead went slack was stand. Delia unbuckled the hood. She got it off over the ears, and the mare blinked and put her nose down and blew at the ground, and then she lifted her head and looked at the woman in front of her, and Delia Ruark put both arms around that scarred neck and stood there in front of the whole county with her face in the mane, and nobody said one word for a considerable time. Garrick Doyle came up out of the dark with his shirt burned and his eyebrows gone, and he stopped in the lantern light about 6 feet away, and he took his hat off, and he did not have a hat, and he stood there with his hand up at his head, an old rich man in front of a widow and a $9 horse, and he could not get anything out. Josiah Kerr got it out for him. He was standing at the mare's head with a lantern up, looking at the country of pale scar down that near side that had been standing 11 inches from a fire front 3 years before, and he said it loud, because he was the man who had laughed at the pens and had come out the door of the store afterward to say he was sorry, and he had been waiting 24 days to be told what he was looking at. "Boys," Josiah Kerr said, "that horse ain't afraid of fire. That horse was made to stand in it. Somebody spent 3 years on this animal, and we sold her by the pound." The suit was filed on the 3rd of November, 1884, in the district court at the county seat, and Garrick Doyle did not file it. The Chalk Bluff Cattle Company had a board in Kansas City and an attorney in Topeka, and when 60,000 acres and 9 miles of fence and 600 tons of hay had burned, and the county's claims began coming in against the company at better than $4,000, the attorney did the thing attorneys do, which was to find somebody else to be liable. He found her in the tax roll. Delia Ruark of Halloway County was the one recorded occupant in the county carrying an official finding of non-compliance with the fire guard ordinance, entered by Commissioner Vester Coyne on the 16th of October, and the ordinance said in plain print that a non-compliant occupant shall be liable in damages for any fire escaping from or crossing his premises, whether or not such fire originated with him. And the fire had crossed her premises. It had come in through her northeast corner and burned 40 acres of her hay meadow, and there were 30 witnesses to it. The company asked $4,800. It was, as a piece of law, not frivolous. That is what made it dangerous. Half the men in that county spent the first week of November explaining to each other that it was a terrible thing, but that the ordinance did say what it said. The hearing was on the 12th of November before Judge Orrin Bayless, and it took one day, and people came in from 4 townships and stood along the walls. Delia Ruark had no lawyer. She had a school teacher's copy of the state statutes, a folded page of the Halloway Sentinel of the 22nd of April 1882, and 3 things she had gone and got. The first was the burn. She had gone out on the morning of the 29th of October, 2 days after, with Mare and Josiah Kerr and 11 other men, and they had walked the black. They started at her northeast corner where the fire had come in, and they walked it backward, rod by rod, reading the stubble. Fire lays the grass over. It does not lay it over the way it ran. It lays it back against the way it ran, because the flame leans into the wind that feeds it, and a burn read that way will point back upwind to its own head every rod of the distance, all the way to the spot where the match went down. Any freighter knew it. The company's attorney had never heard of it in his life. They walked 6.5 miles in 3 days. They drove a numbered stake every 40 rods, and Merritt Sallow, who had 11 years to his pension, and had finally found the one thing he was not going to be reasonable about, wrote down the bearing at every stake and signed each page. The line ran back southwest across the Ruark Quarter, across 4 miles of open range, across the Chalk Bluff Middle Pasture, and into the East Pasture. And it closed on a strip of ground 50 yards long and about 20 feet wide where the burn began, and there was green grass on 3 sides of it. They drove stake number 27 in the middle of it. Sallow made a plat. 12 men signed it. The second thing was the night of the 25th. Willis Kerrigan and Ott McRae had been Chalk Bluff hands for 4 years and 11 years respectively. And on the 27th of October, they had walked 400 yards off black ground behind a hooded mare with their hands full of wet sacks. They testified on the 12th of November that on the night of the 25th, Sim Rathbone had put 300 head down through the Ruark North wire onto her guard, and had told them to leave them there till morning, and that Rathbone had then dragged a log chain behind his horse down the last 40 rods of her furrows, and that they had asked him what for, and he had told them it was none of their business, and that they had thought about it a good deal since. Ott McRae, who was 53 and had never spoken in a courtroom, was asked by the attorney why he was testifying against his own employer. "Because she come and got me," he said. The third thing came 22 miles in Caleb Reams's freight wagon on a bed of loose hay with a quilt over him. They carried Otis Vane in and set him in a chair facing the room he could not see, and he gave his age as 74 and his occupation as freighter, retired, and he identified the mare standing outside the courthouse door by having her led up to the open window, and he put his hands on her face and told the court her name, her foaling date, her dam, her sire, the brand on her hip and which side he had put it on, and the fold in the top of the left ear, before anybody had told him one word about her. Then Mrs. Wheatley's paper was read into the record, and the old man said the last of it over again out loud in his own voice, because he had been saying it in his head for 2 years and 11 days. "Any report that that mare is afraid of fire is false," Otis Vane said, "and is the exact opposite of the fact. She is the finest piece of work I ever done in my life, and 4 men in a row looked straight at it and called it a defect, and the last one sold her for meat at 1 cent a pound. She stood in a fire front in 1881 and held 6 head and 3 men on burnt ground. And she stood in one on the 27th of October, and she will stand in the next one, and there ain't a horse in this state that will do it, because there ain't another man fool enough to spend 3 years making one." Garrick Doyle testified for the defense at 4 o'clock in the afternoon against his own company over the open objection of his own attorney, and what he said took less than 2 minutes. He said Sim Rathbone had lit that fire under his general authority as foreman, and that whether or not Rathbone had also filled Mrs. Ruark's guard with a chain, the fire was the company's and the company's alone, and that at the time the fire started he was holding a demand note of hers for $240 and an open offer for her quarter section. And he wished the court to enter that fact in the record, because there was no way to say the rest of it honestly without it. Then he said that on the evening of the 27th of October, he had been on 80 acres of grass with fire backing into it, and 22 head he could not move, and 5 men including himself, and that he had come off it, holding a rope behind a horse he had been told was worthless, and that he had personally offered to buy that horse for what her hide would bring. Judge Bayless found for the defendant on the 12th of November 1884, and on the cross petition found the Chalk Bluff Cattle Company liable to the several claimants of Halloway County in the sum of $4,860, and to Delia Ruark in the sum of $612 for hay fence meadow and the loss of use of 40 acres. The Board of Commissioners struck the $50 from the tax roll at the December meeting. Vester Coyne voted for the motion. He was not returned to the board in the fall of 1885, and he sold out in 1887 and went to Oregon. Sim Rathbone left the county before Christmas and was not charged with anything, because the county attorney could not make a case out of a chain and 2 witnesses, and because he never came back to be tried on it. Garrick Doyle came out to the Two Wells Divide on the 6th of December with the note in his coat pocket and gave it to her canceled, marked paid in full across the face of it, in his own hand, and stood in her dooryard and asked whether she would sell him the mare's first foal at whatever she cared to name, and Delia Ruark said she would sell him a horse at the same price she would sell anybody, and that he would have to wait his turn like the rest, and Garrick Doyle said that was fair and waited 3 years. The Halloway Sentinel of the 14th of November 1884 carried a piece at the top of the first column, unsigned, under the head A correction AN apology. It ran to 11 lines. The last of them read, "We have been shown at some cost to this county the difference between a horse that is afraid of fire and a horse that has been taught not to be, and we are obliged to record that the only person in Halloway who knew the difference was the person we saw fit to make sport of." Odette Prain did not speak to Delia Ruark again for 2 years, and then in the spring of 1887 she came out to the place and bought a 4-year-old gelding for her nephew and paid $185 for him in cash, and asked, at the gate, whether he would stand and smoke, and Delia said he would, and Odette said, "Then I'll take him," and that was the whole of the reconciliation, and it was enough for both of them. Caleb Reams finished the windmill. He did it in March of 1885 without being asked, and the first Delia knew of it was the sound of the crate coming open behind the barn. He had the wheel up in 2 days, and the vane after it, and when the wind came around out of the south it turned, and it pumped, and the 2 of them stood in the yard and watched water come up out of a well that had been dry for 20 months because there was nothing on top of it. He asked her in the fall of that year, standing at the corral fence with his hat in his hands and taking a long time about it, and she said yes before he had properly finished, and they were married on the 11th of April, 1886, at the Kirtleys, and Ruth Kirtley cried loud enough to be heard at the road. Otis Vane came off the County Poor Farm on the 2nd of January, 1885. Caleb hauled him in his trunk the 22 miles, and Delia gave him the east room with the window, which he could not see out of and asked to have opened anyway, and he lived there 6 years and 4 months, and died in his chair in May of 1891 at the age of 80. What he did with those 6 years was teach. The mare had a filly on the 9th of May 1886, a heavy sorrel with a blaze, and Delia named her Bess after the old man's mare, and Otis Vane started that filly at 90 days old, blind by feel, with a handful of green grass on a coal in a bucket set 40 feet from the feed pan, and moved it 1 handspan a day. By 1890, there were 31 horses in 3 counties carrying the Ruark and Vane brand that would stand to fire. And they went to freight outfits, and to railroad section bosses, and to 2 construction contractors, and to the fire wardens of 4 counties, and they sold at $150 to $225 a head, and there was a waiting list 2 years long, and not one of them was ever advertised, because the only advertisement that outfit ever had was a 60,000-acre burn and a woman walking out of it. The Kansas legislature amended the fire guard statute in 1887. The amendment struck the clause making a non-compliant occupant liable for a fire that merely crossed his ground, and it was written by a man in Topeka who had read the bailiff's opinion, and nobody in Halloway County was ever told that they had anything to do with it. The sorrel Mare lived to be 24 years old and died in the pasture on the Two Wells Divide in the spring of 1899 in the sun, and she is buried at the head of Cutbank Draw under the line she cut, where the plowed furrows still show green after a rain in a different color from the grass around them, and they show there yet. Delia Ruark kept a tin lamp on the table in that house for 51 years, and she trimmed the wick every night of her life. And once, late, when a woman from the Topeka paper came out and asked her the question they all asked, which was how she had known, she said she had not known anything. She said she had only noticed that the horse was standing in the smoke. And then she said the rest of it, and the woman from the paper wrote it down, and it is the reason anybody remembers any of this at all. There is nothing to a wick. It is the cheapest thing in the lamp and the ugliest, and it goes black and crooked, and every fool who ever lived will tell you it is the part to throw away. And there is no light in the world without it. The oil cannot burn on its own. The glass has nothing to hold. All that brass and tin sits dark on the table, waiting on one worthless strip of cotton to carry the fire up out of the well where it can do no good, and hold it steady in the air where it can. What people call worthless is almost never worthless. It is only a thing that is doing its work somewhere nobody has learned to look.